All right, good morning. Today we are going to do a heat set video. This is a brand new number 6 nib that I just completed making this morning. Fully welded tipping. And as you can see, well, if we can get it, there we go. Slitted pretty good. I was able to keep the full tipping ball, no modifications to it, and the nib turned out pretty nice. As a size comparison, I wanted to show you guys my nib up against one of the commercially made nibs by Jowo or Bock. I think this is a Jowo. I'm not sure. I have one that I keep on hand. This is a steel nib. Mine is made of continuum. But they're relatively about the same size. Now, I choose to slit differently. Based upon the stiffness of the nib that I want to create, I either elongate my slit or I shorten it to get the stiffer tine, so there won't be so much flex. But with steel, it probably wouldn't matter. All right, in case you guys haven't seen my nibs and their feeds, this is how they look. Basically similar to a Jowo feed. And soon I'll be doing a brand new series on nib making because I've made a lot of adjustments and a lot of improvements on making my nibs. So stay tuned. That'll be the next series of How To with Hooligan. But I thought I'd throw this one in really quick just to show you how I heat set each one of my nibs. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is first give a shout out to my friend Mark Bacchus, who has helped me so much with my nibs and a few other great nib makers and nib meisters. But over the last 3 years, I've learned a lot about nibs that I never knew before, because just being a pen maker, you have the commercially made nibs, the Jowos, the Bocks, and a lot of the other nibs that just work perfectly fine right out of the gate. But it's different when you're making your own nibs. And if you don't know the major components of a nib, you have what this is the feed. And the feed has an ink nipple here that attaches to a converter. We all know what a converter is if you know anything about pens. And this goes into a housing, basically, that's kind of like just a little cup. And it has a little spigot, and this goes right through here, and inside there, the nib lays flat on top of this, and your converter will poke in here and attach here, and then it delivers the ink through this channel. And these fins right here will hold extra ink as is needed. Now, they do make some that don't have those. I'm not sure how they work. I've always just used this type. But basically, those are your 3 parts to your nib units, that if you're making nibs or you have nibs that are the same as the commercially made ones. So, like I said, if you buy a commercially made nib, then you don't have a problem usually with leakage. Now, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. It depends. I don't know. But with custom-made nibs, all that goes out the window. You're going to have to adjust and attune and heat set every nib that you make. So what are the problems with making a custom-made nib? Well, obviously, you're going to run into the problems of leaks. That is a huge issue. That is my major issue. And usually it's because if you look at it in a simplified form, it's just one thing laying on top of another thing. What you're trying to do is to get those things to be coplanar, okay? Because the enemy is air. Too much air equals leaks. So sometimes you'll have something like this, where you'll have the nib and your feed will start to go like this. That right there is a recipe for leakage, and you don't want that. So because the nib feeds are made out of ebonite, that's basically just rubber, you have the ability to heat the rubber and push it towards the nib and to eliminate the air through the entire surface. You do need some air because every feed has an air gap. It has to, because it allows air to go in and push it out. It's a capillary reaction. There, you know, it's basically a road. It's a road that your ink travels on, and it has to have the ingress and the egress. You have to have the air, and then it feeds out the liquid. I'm not a freaking scientist, but that's basically in a nutshell. If you don't have that, your liquid will just sit there and it won't go anywhere. The reason I know that is because I made my very first feed and I didn't have an air gap and it just sat there. When I did open the air gap, I opened it too much and the thing leaked like a sieve. All right? Okay, so the next thing I want to tell you is this. These are your tines. Here is open, this is closed. People who want wetter nibs typically like to open up their tines a little bit to allow more ink to flow. But there is a compromise. And if you get too open or your nib is not heat set right, it could cause leaks. On the other hand, and this is, you know, we have a very narrow slit and it's tight, it could also choke the nib and not allow ink flow. So that's when you take it to your nib meisters like Mark, Damien, Kirk, and Masuyama, and they have the ability, because they've been doing it for years and years, and they know what they're doing to compromise what you're looking for. Basically, when I take a nib to Mark, I want to make sure that it's flowing decently, but not too much. And then he has the ability, he always tells me, it's easier to make it flow more than to make it choke more, or more ink is easier to get than less ink. So basically what I want to do is I want to start out with something similar to this, maybe not as, but just a little variation. So it goes kind of like this. So you want to, you want to have a nice thin funnel shape. All right. All right, here's my nib. It's in my dummy section that I use for number 6 nibs. Now, I considerably make a lot more 8s than 6s. That's why I decided to do a 6 on this one. I've made over 80 number 6 nibs. I've only made 80 number 8 nibs, and I've only made about 23. This is actually number 23, number 6 nibs. I get a lot more call for number 8 nibs. People love them, but, I do make I think, which is pretty decent number 6 nib. And I'll probably, hopefully, start making a lot more of them. But they're a little bit easier to heat set because the volume of rubber here is a lot smaller than the volume in the number 8. So it's a perfect way, and a lot more people, I think, the number 6 is a lot more common of a nib than a number 8. But you want to start off with making sure that your nib is seated well. And that your nib is not too loose. And you have the ability to add the converter. Next, we're going to go over and I'll show you how I start my heat set process. All right, the way I heat set is a little bit different than maybe some people. I use a mini heat gun. Why do I use a mini heat gun? Because it is very effective and very quick. If you use the hot water trick, the problems with the hot water trick is that sometimes that hot water vapor, and it's hard to get it always at the same temperature, but sometimes that hot water vapor gets up into your housing and it can also distort your housing. So that's one of the reasons I don't use it, because when I did use it and I found that it was kind of also altering the shape of my housing. And the only thing I want to do is alter the shape, not the shape, but alter the position of my feed, not my housing. All right. The also thing I do is I keep a little small container of water. As you can see, this is blue from the ink. And what that helps me do is as soon as I dip it in here, as soon as I hit it with the heat and I press it with my fingers, I dip it in this water, and what that does is it immediately cools it and hopefully holds its shape. All right? All right, there you see I've got the heat gun on, and what I do is I just wave my hand in front of it to see if I've got it at a certain temp. And right now it's pretty hot. You can do it on 2 settings that this one has, either low or high, obviously. So now what I want to do is I want to introduce my pen nib and feed into the mix here. With about 3 inches right here, I try to hold it, constantly moving it, because it will melt this ebonite. It will also bubble it and blister it. And if you don't want that, then you kind of keep it as far as you can. Now, it's pretty durable stuff. It will, hold up to this. I like to use an acrylic section because the acrylic is more plastic and less ebonite, so it shields the housing from anything. Okay, so I've done that for about, 30 to 40 seconds, keeping it moving, keeping the heat moving. And then what I do is I come over here and I press. Now I press on the flat part, not on the fins. Because if you press on the fins, you'll distort the fins. So pressing it up against this part right here. And basically what you're doing is you're pressing it to create a unilateral coplanar, or I don't know if those are the right words, but you want them to be in sync. All right? Now, not every one of you has a $2,000, $3,000 microscope. Because I'm a hand engraver, I have the ability to have this microscope. But I also use it for looking at my nibs and looking at where my feed is and how the adjustments that I made look. So I'll look through this to see how well my nib seated. And it looks like I've got this one pretty good. And also, it did not separate my tines, as you can see. The tines stayed pretty good. Because you can over stress it, and then what it'll do is it'll open up your tines. All right, so I've added an ink filled, and I use the same ink that my most common nib baster uses, and it's Waterman Serenity Blue. That's what he does all the nibs in, so it keeps it consistent. Because we both are using the same ink, then he'll know what to expect. If I tell him, yeah, this one's a good flow, this one's not such a good flow, and he'll know how to do his changes. So I've got the ink in here, and let's see how we do, if we are going to be leaking or I need to make another couple of adjustments with the heat gun. All right, so I've got my phone in my hand, and the reason is so I can bring the nib closer, and you can see right now, I know the ink is flowing from the section. So right now I don't have any leaks. It's flowing into the feed from the converter, and I've got a good flow rate. I'm going to write for a bit and then turn it back over and see how we're doing. What I usually do is I just use swiggle marks. Because it's not been tuned or it's not been ground, it's not going to give me like great writing. It's just a raw tipping ball, and nothing has been done to it. But it seems to have a nice flow. Do we have any leaks yet? Doesn't look like it. So it looks like our first heat set did the trick. Now, I could go back 1, 2, 3 times sometimes with a number 8. Usually a number 6, I get it into 1 to 2 tries. But a number 8, because the ebonite is much thicker and it's a much more solid piece of ebonite, it could be a little bit more difficult. But it usually takes about 2 or 3 times with a number 8, maybe 4. But this one seems to be writing really well. It's got a nice flow. I can't write too much with it because, like I said, it's not been tuned or ground or anything like that. Mark could open up the flow, or if he chooses, he could, make it a little less. I suppose he's probably going to leave it somewhere right around where this is. But anyway, I hope this helps. If anyone has any questions, I love the method with the heat gun. It works really well. It's really quick, and if you do it right, it'll be rather quick. Also, if you need to see the nib up close, you can get one of those eyepieces that are pretty inexpensive off of eBay or off of Amazon to help you do that. All right? Bye.